Thank you for being here. Thanks to everybody for their opening statements. I'd now like to recognize myself for 5 minutes to begin the questioning, and I'd like to begin with Supervisor Fletcher. I want to thank you again for your service to our country, and now your service on the Board of Supervisors, as well as your time in the state legislature, and particularly on the clear and pressing issue that we're talking about today, veteran homelessness. And I was wondering, before we dive into specific solutions, we're going to be hearing from a lot of people as well in the second panel who are out there in the field working on these issues every day. Could you paint a picture for the hearing record and for our benefit of the current state of veteran homelessness as you see it in San Diego, and anything we should know about the veteran population that is homeless?
No, thank you for that. I think when we look at, a number of folks have alluded to kind of recent numbers and kind of point-in-time count. In that recent point-in-time count, which is just a snapshot, it's not a total picture. It doesn't encapsulate the entirety of the problem. It's one morning and one day. We identified in that 1,100 people who were identified as veterans. Now, out of those, 653 were in a shelter. So they were sheltered and they were housed and they were covered. 448 were unsheltered. That is a 32% decrease from the point-in-time count the year before, and there's other data that suggests in San Diego County it is going down and getting better. I think from my perspective and where I sit, I think the biggest challenge that we face, again, is getting landlords who are willing to accept those VASH vouchers. We just got we have an ad hoc measurements committee at the RTFH where we're really looking at system metrics of how we can hold ourselves accountable for what we want. And the number of veterans who have a voucher but are not utilizing that voucher is of great concern to me, because that's where you all are doing your job to provide the resources and provide the funding, and we have to do our job to do that. Now, again, I alluded to the fact that the rental market is incredibly tight. We have NIMBY challenges in terms of siting new facilities and siting new housing. We have a challenge with app-based home rental. We have vacancy issues with foreign wealth funds buying floors and new towers. We have a lot of things that are contributing to that, but we have to find a way to crack this nut to make sure that that veteran who has that voucher has a place to go. Because when we have challenges in general in homeless, we don't have similar programs where someone will pay to house somebody. And so this ought to be the easiest problem to solve. And so that's where I think we have to move swiftly to identify available land to build housing. At the county, we're doing an inventory of all of our housing. In my district, we have multiple projects going. We have 404 units going in Claremont. We're doing somewhere between 120 and 160 units in downtown, where we take government-owned land and build and then provide those services. And then I just want to go back and really tackle or really highlight, Mr. Chairman, what I think is a really important component, which is when we talk about the epidemic of veteran suicide. The most common refrain you see in the debate is, we'll fix the VA. Well, I've already alluded to, we can always make it better. We always can make everything better. But if you read the actual studies and the information, you'll see that somewhere north of 80% of veteran suicide never called the VA. They never called the VA. And had they called the VA, they would have got world-class care. The reason they didn't call is because of the stigma associated with it. So if you think about in our society, two Marines are in combat side by side. One gets nicked with shrapnel, no scar, no lasting impact, right? They get a medal, and we honor them for their sacrifice. The veteran right beside him has devastating post-traumatic stress from the exact same combat experience, and they don't get anything. We, as a society, still have a stigma around the unseen wounds of war that is preventing veterans when they transition out from getting help. Getting that help is what will keep them housed and keep them employed and keep them in a life of purpose. And so we have to deal with the downstream issue of those who are suffering, get them substance abuse treatment, get them mental health treatment. The efforts to help those regardless of their discharge status is vital, and we got to get landlords to accept. We got to site more housing to get those services there. But I really think tackling the stigma on the front end is a national issue that is of paramount importance. Because again, in so many populations, the problem we have is they don't have access to behavioral health services. Veterans have access to the services. We just got to get them to ask for it. Mm-hmm. And so I just think that is a really important component as well.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I have questions for all the rest of you as well. So if it's okay with my colleagues, we'll go ahead and do 2 rounds for this panel before we move on to the second panel. So with that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it very much, and I want to thank the panel. From your point of view at the local level, what is the one message or need that we need to take back to Washington that would make your job easier or would reduce homelessness among veterans? I think that's the bottom line. Why don't we start with you, sir, if you don't mind?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Bill Rackus. I think I would say affordability may be the one word. Our biggest challenge is, as Supervisor Fletcher said, is often in finding affordable housing for the veterans that need it. Certainly, I think there are other challenges in reaching out to veterans and making them come forward, becoming aware of all of them, but that would probably be the single largest challenge.
Can I ask you a question, again, for the panel, and I know I want everyone to answer the first question, but why do you think we have a high percentage of homeless veterans here in California as opposed to some of these other states? Is it the climate? Are they natives or do they move here? Is it because of the cost of living? Why do you think that's the case? Because it sounds like you guys are doing and gals are doing a great job. And I know we have the funding. We can always increase the funding, put an emphasis on veterans with HUD as well, which, you know, I'd like to ask that question. But yeah, what do you think, Mr. Smith? What do you think, Dr. Smith? Why do you think there's such a higher percentage here in California? I know we have more veterans here in California. There's no question. I think Florida's number 3, but California's number 1 with regard to vets.
I would probably say, Congressman, yes to all of your suggestions. I think it is multifactorial. It is the climate. It is the fact that San Diego and Southern California is welcoming to veterans. I think there is, at times, economic opportunities here that people seek. California is often viewed as the land of opportunity. And many veterans have served in Southern California at different times and remember the area fondly. And so they may come back here seeking services. And there is a reputation that we and others have of providing help to them, so they may be coming seeking help as well.
Okay. Yes, sir.
To your first question?
Yeah,
I would
that'd be
say,
fine,
I would start off with, we also have a program, the Tribal HUD-VASH program, that deals with Native American populations, and that has not been permanently authorized. On the second question, I would say, you know, probably, as Dr. Smith said, sort of yes to everything, but definitely affordable housing issues, as well as, this is my first time in Southern California, and I think the climate would be.
Yeah, it's very nice.
Yeah.
I mean, last night I felt like I was outside and I thought it was in indoors in air conditioning. So it's very pleasant.
Thank you. I don't think I've yet to be convinced by data that veterans shop for the best place to be homeless. I think the climate is very nice. I think, and we certainly have a lot of veterans here, and we have a lot of folks who served here and want to stay here, but we have a disproportionate number of homeless compared to the percentage of veterans, which indicates to me that there's something else that's going on there, and I think it simply goes back to the cost of housing. Our cost of housing is astronomically high. I was recently in Kansas, and if you're a veteran in Topeka, Kansas, you can use your VAST voucher. Someone will take it. There will be a housing that will be there. The other challenge that we face in California is as we confront the issues of wildfires, of climate change, of carbon emissions, of vehicle miles traveled, the challenge for us to increase our supply of housing is to increase our density in existing areas of housing. And so everyone wants you to build housing as long as you don't build it anywhere near them. Well, the problem is you can't build housing that isn't near somebody. And so because there's nowhere to go where you can do it and still meet the other goals we have. And I'll give you a specific example. I think it was 3 years ago. I look up exactly. We had a affordable housing project that was going in the city of Poway. Wonderful folks, love their country, love their veterans. It was 11 units. I mean, it was all of 11 units. And traffic was mitigated, everything was taken care of, and we had more veterans on the waiting list than spots available. But the opposition to that was outrageous. And community opposition killed 11 units that all would have gone to veterans with the promise that they would bring it back in the right spot. And here we spent 3 years later, those 11 units have not been brought back. And so we have a challenge that we have to overcome as policymakers of addressing legitimate community concerns, making sure things work with traffic and all those issues and safety, and then saying at the end of the day, we have to build this housing. And I don't think it's a disregard for veterans. It's just a disregard for veterans who have mental health issues or substance abuse issues or who are low income and have affordable housing, because those are the three categories of housing that no one wants near them. And so I think that there's a notion of, and I'll wrap up, there's a notion of, I've heard the analogy of it's like we have neighborhoods who say there's a leak in your side of the boat. Go fix it somewhere. Well, we're all in the boat together, and there has to be a collective sense that every neighborhood and every community is going to have to shoulder its share of the load in taking affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, behavioral health and substance abuse programs, and we can design them in a way that preserves the integrity of the neighborhood. But that's a fight we have here in San Diego, and I'm constantly engaging with community groups where they say, well, we don't want these folks here. And I said, but those folks are there now. They're in your canyons, they're in your alleys, they're on the streets. So let's get them in a clean, safe environment for a better thing. And so we just have to have the courage to push those through.
Agreed. Thank you. I yield back. I know we have another round.
We'll have another round, and with that, I'd like to recognize Chairman Takano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Levin. Supervisor, I want us to delve more into this topic because it's not just here in San Diego. I was talking to one of the LA County supervisors, and this particular supervisor was telling me stunning stories about projects, housing projects specifically designed to help veterans. And this supervisor was just astounded at the virulent opposition. And I was, I understand, Riverside was one of the places in the 1980s that rapidly developed, and I understand the backlash that communities can have against developments, rapid development. I can understand what, say, high-density developments that have a low-income element to it. People in single-family homes, detached homes, will rally and say, we don't want poor people in our community. So, and I think this is playing out all over various communities in California. And but I was, the goodwill toward veterans, and as I think you say, it's veterans with substance abuse challenges, veterans that this is what the community gets wind of, and then they rise up. What do you think? Do you have more further thought? I mean, you're new to this, but I think this is, I think supervisors and county and city council people, the people who have to make these land use decisions, have the hardest job, really.
Well, no, and I think a lot about this. This dominates a lot of my thought, both as a supervisor who has land use authority. Now, in the unincorporated areas is where we have less opportunity, but as someone who delves on these issues, but also as someone, the governor also appointed me to the California Air Resources Board. We were tasked with meeting our greenhouse gas emission targets and goals. And so we have these conflicting goals of we have to significantly increase the availability of housing, not just for veterans, not just for those who are homeless, but you got folks that are working. I mean, you have folks that are working a full-time job and living in their car. And so we have to increase the housing there. And so the notions, the intersection, I believe, Mr. Chairman, is the intersection of transportation and housing. So part of this is community opposition. We have to design projects. We have to put together things that we know are going to work, right? We can't have a devastating project. We can't put a 100-story tower in the middle of a residential area and it would be devastating, it would be bad. We have to design them in a way that mitigates legitimate community concerns. And then we have to have the courage to overcome pure NIMBYism against people because they are low income or they are suffering from an illness or an addiction, right? And that is on us because we're going to be held accountable for not addressing the problem. And so you're going to get grief there. I think we have to be willing to take the grief to address the problem. But the other component of this, particularly in California, is issues surrounding transit and transportation. And so where we have the greatest potential and opportunity for growth is in the urban areas where we do urban infill and we increase density. Now, because of the challenges we face with vehicle miles traveled, up over $1 billion in San Diego County in the last 10 years. Although we hit our 2020 climate change goals, we are not on track statewide to hit our 2030 goals. In fact, we're going in the wrong direction. And so the only way we're going to do that is by changing the way we approach transportation to have an actual investment in transit in areas where we have density of housing and density of employment. And if you can do that, then you can start to alleviate some of the traffic issues, some of the greenhouse gas issues, some of the parking issues. But again, that requires a fundamental change in thinking, of rethinking. It's not just about expanding freeways, which we know in induced demand only increases congestion. It's about getting us, even a small percentage of those folks, out of those into transit. And so I think the intersection of transportation and housing is vital to tackling this issue broadly and getting communities to realize that we can add this and it's not going to increase your local congestion. And then some of this is just a change of mindset. We have to go out and make the case for why these programs are important, why they are. And then sometimes we have to do the difficult work of you have 17 folks from a neighborhood and they're really upset, but there's 17 of them. You know, this is the project I have in Claremont. I got 404 units going in. And so we have to, at a certain point, do everything we can to build consensus and coalitions and get people to buy in. And then at a certain point, we got to pull the trigger and we got to approve things. And we have to be willing to take that and go out and explain for why that's in our collective interest and good. And so some of it is overcoming community opposition, and some of it is folks in my situation being willing to make the difficult decisions. And then the last point I'll say on this is there's been a great debate in the state of California at the legislative level about who really should have land use authority. We saw Senator Wiener introduce legislation that in many ways would take that away from local entities, right, and create more by right development in areas where the development is right. And my message to local governments, and it's heresy for a local government person to say this, but if we can't get the job done, then maybe they should take it away. If local governments can't figure out how to approve the housing that we need in appropriate areas, right, then perhaps we shouldn't be the ones tasked. There's nothing written, you know, in society that we're the only ones that have land use. And so I think that continual pressure that you see from the governor here in terms of suing local jurisdictions for not hitting their RENA targets, and in terms of the legislature, in terms of looking at very controversial changes to how we zone and land use, I think are very important conversations that have to be had, but have to lead to an increase in density.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Representative Peters for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually, as the supervisor was speaking, I actually wrote down Poway on my note before you got to me, because that was sort of the illustration of one of the challenges, which is you had a community that you would suspect would be supportive of veterans, but they all came out against this 11 unit. You know, 11 units is not 10,000 units, and I think frankly, with the unwillingness of the local electeds to do what you said, Supervisor, which is to stand up to that, was really shocking, but not uncommon. And I would just add, I think that it's clear that one of the biggest, maybe the biggest challenges for us in homelessness in San Diego is the cost of housing in general. More supply will lower the cost of housing. And I agree with what you said, except that I think in the gap is something we call the Environmental Quality, the California Environmental Quality Act, which empowers single individuals to file lawsuits against projects, even if they have nothing to do with the environment, even if they're on surface parking lots, have nothing to do with sensitive resources. That's got to be cut back so that local elected officials can do their jobs and be empowered and not be disempowered or undercut by lawsuits by literally one or two disgruntled people. I think we have not come to grips with that, and if the state would take one action, short of taking away land use authority, is empower local elected officials to do what you said. Let's give them the chance to do the right kind of development, to build more housing in a way not just that preserves the neighborhoods, but improves them through investment. So I certainly agree with you. And Supervisor Fletcher, we're lucky to have you in this position with your background and with your history of fighting for these issues. I do want to ask specifically, I'm going to get to you, Ms. Puttyfoot, with the same kind of question, is what is it Congress can do to bolster these programs for veterans, especially those with chronic homelessness? What do you think are the priorities we should take back for this committee and in general for Congress?
Sure.
Well, I'm clearly not an expert on veteran homelessness, but I can speak briefly about the chronic homelessness issue. I think that's one reason that the state has put an emphasis on the development of permanent supportive housing. We know that there's a need for housing that is combined with services that are tailored to an individual and are not time limited, and that provide an opportunity for, whether it's veterans or other chronically homeless individuals, to receive the ongoing support they need to stay housed. I think one of the things that we haven't touched on here is that it's much more cost-effective to keep people housed than it is to address them once they're homeless. And so, when we're looking at this from our perspective and being tasked with looking at ways to reduce the overall numbers of homeless in California generally, one of the areas that we're really focusing on is rapid rehousing or diversion before homelessness actually occurs.
Those are programmatic suggestions, or descriptions of what California's doing. The implication, I think, is that you want us to continue funding or increase funding from the federal government. Is that it? Is that your answer?
You put me in a little bit of an awkward spot given my position here, but I think definitely funding is at the heart. Programs follow funding.
Can I just ask a specific question about the California response to leveraging resources like the low-income housing tax credit? We understand that lost a little value with the tax plan that Congress passed, the president's tax plan in 2017, I guess, because there's not as much to write off against it. Can you tell us if there's ways you think that program can be improved from the perspective of housing California's homeless?
I'm not versed, unfortunately, in that, and can't address that. I will say that in addition to funding, one of the most important areas, whether it's federal, state, or local, is to really align programs and supports and funding. I think that collaborative process to sort of minimize the administrative burden on local jurisdictions is really critical.
Okay,
and that's one reason we provided flexible block grant funding.
Supervisor Fletcher, maybe 30 seconds.
Yeah, one thing I think from Congress that would be incredibly helpful, there is tremendous instability in general in the federal government. It's not from your branch of government, and it's not from the Supreme Court. And so I think, but the problem is we're dealing in markets, and we're asking people to make long-term commitments to build projects. We're asking them to make long-term commitments to site property, and the instability is a real problem. And so knowing that the VASH voucher will be there, it will be funded, it will be protected. Knowing that these HUD programs will be there, they will be funded, they will be protected, is a really important thing that sends signals when I go to folks and say, we need to do this. And when there's all of this instability, people don't know day to day what will happen. It makes it hard. And none of these problems will solve themselves quickly. And so I just think that continued commitment to the HUD funding, not just veterans housing, all their housing programs, because we're cobbling things together to try and make them work. And that's where I think the Congress in a bipartisan way can be that source of stability to say these are things we're going to fight to protect and ensure will be there. And that's a specific thing that would be helpful to us at the local level.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to thank you for that, because it's a perfect segue to what I'm about to ask. I'm going to recognize myself again for 5 more minutes. I wanted to ask about HUD VASH specifically, and wanted to start with Secretary Kurtz. In your testimony, I noted that you mentioned HUD did not request new HUD VASH vouchers in fiscal year 2020 because the 2019 funding was enough to meet the demand of current referrals. Would we be correct to interpret that as meaning more HUD VASH voucher funding would not increase the number of veterans served? And if that's the case, can you explain?
Sure. At this point, actually, HUD has not requested additional HUD VASH funding since, I believe it was fiscal year 2015. And we believe that there is sufficient funding currently across the nation, that we just need to sort of work to utilize what funding is there currently to ensure that we and the VA are working working together to house the veterans, as well as we are looking at flexibility such as we've taken are allowing VA medical centers, the regions that they cover, we can switch vouchers from one public housing authority to another in that area. And if need to, we have not yet, but we are looking at possibly even moving funding at a broader scale if need be.
So I wanted to address that. As I understand it, community agencies refer veterans to HUD VASH through the coordinated entry system. Is it possible that the community partners are unable to refer more individuals due to their own capacity limits? And if that's the case, how do we address that issue?
Actually, that's a really interesting question, because I have, before I came back to HUD, I worked at the local level and worked with, one of the programs I worked with was HUD-VASH. And we were concerned about issues like that, and actually just sort of brought everyone together, the VA, our local partners, myself, folks in the city, as well as the local housing authority, and, tried to work out strategies to ensure that we were coordinating better. It's really a collaboration and a communication that we need to ensure is taking place at the local level. And we saw success after that happened.
Thank you. I'd like to switch from HUD to VA and to talk about VA funding for intake and for case management. My understanding is HUD-VASH eligible veterans are often chronically homeless. They have severe health problems and they require intensive services and support. Dr. Smith, can you discuss any challenges your staff face in serving this population and any additional resources that they may need and therefore that you may need at the VA?
Thank you, Chairman Levin. You are correct that the population that are served by HUD-VASH vouchers can be challenging. They represent individuals who may be chronically homeless, but also often have disability, mental illness, substance use, and simply reaching them can be challenging. We have both intake staff as well as HUD-VASH case managers that are working continuously to reach out into areas where veterans may be. We have 5 outreach staff currently, and 3 of those are field-based, sometimes working with San Diego Police Department or Oceanside Police Department to actually go out into areas where veterans might be living in an encampment or in some other non-habitable situation. So part of our program is involved in outreach, and then there's also an intake part. That intake part sometimes can be challenging, again, because it requires typically a face-to-face visit with a veteran that takes some time. There may be documents that are unavailable, and that intake process sometimes can be a delay in getting the voucher packet to the PHA and then to getting the veteran housed. We have at different times had staffing issues. I'm happy to say that we are right now staffed up and able to process those vouchers.
I wanted to ask a follow-up. I was struck by Supervisor Fletcher's previous comment that the biggest challenge is getting landlords willing to take VASH vouchers. My understanding is that there are several incentives that the county offers to landlords to accept those VASH vouchers. Trying to understand from the supervisor or from Dr. Smith, where does that funding originate, and is it sufficient? Is it a matter of more funding needed to secure housing and to get more landlords willing to take these vouchers? And either of you or both of you can feel free to address that.
Well, we take that funding from our general fund. That's county general purpose money that we could spend on anything, and we dedicate it to that. We try to cobble together it wherever we can get it from. And that really is key because we're trying to overcome that barrier. If that landlord can rent it to somebody for more money and they aren't homeless, they don't have a problem, they're more likely to do that. And so it's a real challenge for us. And I think the efforts to address the value of the VASH voucher in high-cost areas are really important because we have a high-cost area and we're trying to address that. But potentially having that is really important. If there were funding available to help increase these incentives, that is a greater tool that we have. That's where we're giving them bonuses for taking them. We're providing insurance if they damage anything. We're guaranteeing the utilities will be paid. We're just trying to get them comfortable with being willing to do it. And so that is an area where some jurisdictions provide those incentives, some don't. Some do what they can, but they could always do more. And then I think the flexibility around housing authorities is very important. At the county, we are the housing authority for the unincorporated area, and we're the housing authority for 13 of the 18 incorporated jurisdictions within the county. But you have San Diego, Oceanside, Carlsbad, Encinitas, and National City have their own housing authorities. They get their own VASH vouchers. And so the abilities, the greater flexibility there is almost always good. And so I would say high-cost areas is a really important area to view those as distinct and different, particularly when they have more severe levels of veteran homelessness. I think the incentive programs and potential funding to augment or increase incentives. Obviously, you don't want folks to cut back commitments they've already made because it comes, but if they could increase what they're already doing, and the flexibility are 3 things that I think would be helpful. And then I just want to reemphasize the case management piece is vital, because we've also had a very big problem with, we get them housed and then they don't stay housed, right? Because they're having all of these issues, and that case manager is that person who's going to work them through. They're going to work them through the system. They're going to stick with them. They're going to stay with them. They're going to check on them. They're going to encourage them. And, you know, when you encounter folks that are suffering chronic homelessness, it takes a lot of visits and a lot of patience. This is very, very, very hard work to get someone to transform their life. And so that case management supportive role, the goal is not just to get them in a place with the VASH voucher where they have an unstable, unpredictable, unhealthy life. I mean, that's better than being on the street. But then we got to figure out how we get them there, and that's where that case management piece is vital.
Appreciate it, Supervisor. I want to make sure that we move along fairly quickly. We want to get to our second panel. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Bilirakis for a second round of questions for our first panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Putterfoot, what best practices can other counties in the state take away, or even in the nation? What best practices can we take away from Riverside County to reach the goal of functional zero for veteran homelessness? And I'm going to give the chairman partial credit for that. It represents the county, so outstanding. What best practices can we take away?
Well, I really could defer to the chairman here, but from what we've observed, there was a real collaboration and coming together of all of the different organizations and entities that touch on veteran care, veteran housing, to really provide that comprehensive approach, but also to tailor it individually and to take into account, as Supervisor Fletcher mentioned, the specific needs for case management and provide that on an ongoing basis. The other thing that I know Riverside County has done is use the data that is collected through the Homeless Management Information System to really provide some feedback and some rigorous analytics about what is working within their communities and where the gaps are. And I think if we could replicate that, we're currently at the agency level really looking into how the state could encourage all local jurisdictions to have access to the kind of data and analytics. We've seen that being effective not only in Riverside, but also in Santa Clara County and Los Angeles and elsewhere. So it's that collaborative piece of bringing everyone to the table, which in some places is really happening, but in a lot of jurisdictions, it's still very siloed, which means that all the right people are not in the room to make it happen.
Mr. Chairman, would you like to add anything to that?
You know, just that I've worked, our office has worked with the county, and the county is a really key player because it's actually a county statistic. And two very empowered people within the county staff had the authority and just the sheer energy to dedicate themselves to this. And they're really now, as is so often the case with working on veterans issues, veterans are not necessarily all that much different in their challenges than the general population. And so they're ready to apply the things they've learned on how to effectively reach veterans, how to plan for the case management. I do believe they also did a lot of work with landlords on the incentive side. So they're a little frustrated now because they need the resources to deal with the general homeless population. And so they're kind of armed with the basic learnings that they have gleaned from working on this veterans issue.
Very good. Thank you. I guess I have a little more time, Mr. Chairman. I won't take it all. Who wants to answer this question? What role does substance abuse play in hindering success for the chronically homeless, and which programs should be invested in to address this issue? So important, and it's all linked together, whether it's mental health or substance abuse with regard to homelessness. And that's not always the case, but who would like to address that?
I'll talk very briefly on this. You can't talk about mental health and substance abuse as separate issues. They're one issue. The co-occurring rates of both of those are in the 80s and 90s. The overwhelming majority of folks who are homeless who have a substance abuse problem arrived at that problem by self-medicating an undiagnosed and untreated mental health issue. If we just deal with the mental health, they're still addicted. If we just deal with the addiction, there's still that. And so we got to view it in the context of behavioral health, which means medication for addiction treatment. It works. I mean, the data is irrefutable that it works. And then there's controversial things like needle exchange that save lives, promote public health, help get people clean. And some of these are uncomfortable or difficult, but all of the healthcare data suggests this is the way we address it. And so I think substance abuse is a cornerstone is in terms of addressing this challenge we face.
Very good. Anyone else?
I would just add that in California, we adopted legislation to really require funded housing by the state to adopt housing first principles, which include low barrier and a prohibition against refusing to provide housing or housing-based services for someone solely because they have behavioral health issues. And so that really, it's been research-based, evidence-based best practice around making sure that people are housed in order to provide effective support for dealing with behavioral health issues.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Chairman Takano for a second round of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Levin. Dr. Smith, while the VA's budget is at record levels, we are still seeing needs across the agency for all services. Meanwhile, our committee really regularly hears from NGOs or in other words, private companies who offer their own solutions for homelessness in Southern California. What is the process and capacity for VA to accept outside funding to address the homeless challenge? Is there a process?
Congressman, I'm afraid I would have to take that one for the record because that's not something that I work a lot on locally. The bulk of the funding is managed out of the central office programs who put out requests for grants, notices of funding applications.
So you're not really prepared to talk about private-public partnerships in this area of
Well,
homelessness?
I'm not prepared to talk about funding for them. I would say that those private-public partnerships are very important, and particularly the work that we do with partners here. I would point out to some of the panelists, the second half, Veterans Villages of San Diego, Interfaith, and so forth.
So my questions might be addressed to the second panel, is what you're
Perhaps,
saying.
sir.
Okay. The transition process is something that our committee has been deeply involved with, and Chairman Levin and Ranking Member Blaurakis and a number of our committee members are Mr. Cisneros from Orange County. They're all particularly attuned to trying to improve this transition process. So I want to switch gears a little bit from the importance of wraparound services for chronic homelessness. I think it's really important to emphasize that for our chronic homeless population, as the supervisor said, it's a lot of work and a lot of resources to support people in getting their lives in order. But on the front end, trying to help veterans transition smoothly to avoid paying out large amounts of unemployment insurance. It seems to me that we could do a better job on the front end. And I know that Camp Pendleton has the Skills Bridge program that I've been hearing the VA ramp up across the country. That is something that I find very promising. Can you, I'd like to ask what we should be doing, what we should be sharing with service members to ensure that they don't find themselves homeless, and how we can improve the transition process.
Thank you for that question, Congressman. Certainly the transition, area of transition is critical. In San Diego, we have a robust transition program where we're really reaching out, particularly in working with the medical treatment facilities to accept those who have been identified as having needs at the time of separation from the service. But I think, as you point out, there's a large cadre of active duty military who separate without, for a variety of reasons, either knowing as much as they might about VA services or perhaps just not feeling like it was time for them. One of the complaints I often get when I'm out in the community is veterans that either don't know about the VA or feel like they weren't told about the VA at the time of their separation from active duty. So I think that is an area that we are all committed to improving. I certainly know that there's work going on at a national level to try and change or to assist in that, so that we have really a continuous process of reaching out to veterans to make them aware of veteran services that are available to them.
Supervisor, you look like you have something to say about this.
Well, I think the efforts on the job stuff is really good. There's funded programs. They can do it while they're on active duty, while they're getting off. I think all of that's good. I think that's improved significantly. I got out a decade ago. One thing that struck me when I was in, and perhaps it's been addressed, is you have a lot of service members who get out and have no idea what they want to do next because they never thought about it. They never thought about it. And it always struck me when I was in the Marine Corps, every year I went to the career planner. And the career planner, we'd have our counseling session about my Marine Corps career. Where did I want to go? What did I want to be assigned? What job? What duty? What term of enlistment? And it would be interesting, folks in DOD would know better, but perhaps when they join in boot camp, there's just someone who asks them a question, hey, how long do you think you want to stay in? And what do you think you want to do when you get out? Right? And then they write it down. And then the next year when they go to the career planner, someone says, hey, you said you wanted to stay in for life. How long do you think you want to stay in? What do you think you might want to do when you get out? And if we did that every year with a veteran, just what do you think you want to do when you get out? Because otherwise they get discharged and then they're just wandering. And then there's all these programs and services, but now they're disconnected from that period out, and they're not in a mindset of having a plan for what they want to do. And so perhaps that's been addressed in recent years.
Well,
But
Supervisor,